World War II was not only a military conflict, but also a clash of personalities, ideologies, and completely opposing worldviews. Among all the rivalries that marked those years, one of the most intense and decisive was the one between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill. On one side was Hitler, the leader of the Third Reich, who dreamed of a Europe dominated by Nazi Germany, an empire that would extend over the peoples he considered inferior. On the other side stood Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who became the firmest voice of resistance, determined not to yield an inch to the threats of Nazism. The two men were profoundly different in their origins, character, and ambitions. Hitler, shaped by personal frustration and resentment after Germany's defeat in World War I. Churchill, heir to Britain's imperial tradition, had a tumultuous political career, but was always guided by the conviction that Great Britain must preserve its greatness and freedom. Throughout the war, Hitler came to hate Churchill with a visceral intensity. He did not see him merely as a political opponent, but as a personal obstacle, someone whose determination, speeches, and ability to unite the British people stood in the way of the victory the Führer believed to be inevitable. This video will explore that enmity in depth, how it was born long before the war, how it was fueled by every strategic decision, and how it became one of the key factors that shaped the course of the most devastating conflict of the 20th century. The guiding question is clear. Why did Hitler hate Churchill? To understand the rivalry between Hitler and Churchill, it is necessary to first look at the origins of each man. Let's begin with Winston Churchill. He was born in 1874 at Blenheim Palace, into one of the most influential families in the United Kingdom. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent politician, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, was American, something that gave Winston an early connection to the broader Anglo-Saxon world beyond Europe. Churchill's childhood was marked by a certain distance from his parents, but also by an education steeped in the values of the British aristocracy. He was not a brilliant student at the schools he attended. In fact, he struggled academically, but he soon found a path that truly inspired him: the military career. He entered the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, where he began to forge the traits that would later define him: discipline, ambition, and immense self-confidence. After graduating, he served in various parts of the British Empire, in India, Sudan, and later in South Africa, where he took part in the Boer War. These experiences not only brought him close to the realities of warfare, but also turned him into a war correspondent, as from an early age he began writing about what he saw and lived through. Churchill combined two facets that were quite uncommon, that of a soldier and that of a writer. His pen opened doors for him in politics, as his writings not only described battles, but also conveyed a sense of British grandeur, a belief in his country's mission in the world. That vision, inherited from the imperial tradition, would stay with him for life. Once in Parliament, in the early years of the 20th century, Churchill distinguished himself as a bold politician, sometimes controversial, but always passionate in his speeches. He was not a man of half measures. He defended his ideas firmly, even if it cost him allies. In this early stage, the Churchill who would later challenge Hitler was already taking shape. A man molded by imperial tradition, seasoned by real military experience, and deeply convinced that Great Britain had an unshakable role in defending Western civilization. Adolf Hitler's youth was very different. He was born in 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town, into a lower middle-class family. His father, Alois, was a strict and authoritarian customs official. His mother, Clara, on the other hand, gave him a deep affection that profoundly marked his childhood. From an early age, Hitler showed a difficult temperament. At school, he did not stand out for discipline or academic achievement. On the contrary, he was a rebellious student, impatient with rules and drawn to the arts, especially painting and architecture. He dreamed of becoming an artist, but that dream was shattered when, in Vienna, he was rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts. Those years in the Austrian capital were decisive. There, he experienced poverty, lived in shelters, and gradually absorbed an atmosphere charged with anti-Semitism, extreme nationalism, and social resentment. Vienna was a multicultural mosaic. But in that environment, Hitler began to construct an increasingly rigid and exclusionary worldview. His life took a sharp turn with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. He enlisted in the German army and found in war a purpose he had never known before. As a soldier on the Western Front, he served with discipline and courage, was wounded in combat, and received decorations. That experience left a deep mark on him. He felt Germany's defeat in 1918 as a national betrayal. From then on, politics and revenge took the place of his former artistic ambitions. Upon returning to a turbulent Germany, he discovered in rhetoric and public speaking a new path. He began addressing small political groups and soon stood out for his ability to ignite passion among the masses. What had once been a directionless young man was now transforming into someone with a clear mission: to rebuild Germany at any cost and to find those he blamed for its downfall. It was during this period that the foundations of the future Nazi leader were formed, a resentful man with boundless ambition who found in hatred and nationalism a driving force. While Churchill had grown up surrounded by the British imperial tradition and had been shaped within his country's institutions, Hitler was molded by marginalization, frustration, and an environment where extremist ideas offered simple answers to complex problems. When looking at the origins of Churchill and Hitler, it becomes clear early on how their worlds were destined to collide. Both shared military experience and a passion for politics, but the way they interpreted those experiences led them to radically different conclusions. Churchill, shaped by his upbringing within the British Empire, saw Great Britain as a nation with the responsibility to maintain international balance. His conviction was that British power should guarantee stability, free trade, and the defense of a world order in which London held a central role. In his mind, his country's greatness was not only justified, but understood as a historical duty. Hitler, by contrast, interpreted history through resentment. Germany's defeat in the Great War and the hardships of the post-war years convinced him that his nation had been the victim of an unjust humiliation. For him, the Treaty of Versailles was a chain that had to be broken by force, and the only way to restore Germany's greatness was through expansion, by conquering territories and eliminating those he saw as internal and external enemies. The key difference lay in their vision of power. For Churchill, British power was meant to preserve balance, even if from a position of imperial supremacy. For Hitler, power was a tool of total domination, a means to rewrite the map of Europe according to his ideology. On a personal level, both men shared immense ambition and deep self-confidence, but while Churchill channeled those qualities into defending Britain's democratic institutions, Hitler used them to build an authoritarian regime. In this initial contrast, we can already see the seed of their future confrontation. They were not merely two leaders of rival nations. They represented two irreconcilable worldviews: the British Empire standing for liberal tradition against a totalitarian project that sought to destroy everything in its path. After World War I, both Churchill and Hitler followed very different paths that would inevitably cross. Churchill, although he had not yet assumed the central role he would later become known for, remained actively involved in British political life. During the 1920s, he experienced both success and setbacks, at times being excluded from key positions. Nevertheless, he never stopped expressing his views forcefully. He believed that the United Kingdom needed to stay prepared for new threats, and warned that the peace achieved after the 1918 armistice was fragile. At the other end of Europe, Germany was going through one of its most turbulent periods. The Weimar Republic was born weak, plagued by economic crises, unemployment, and the resentment of a people who viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a lasting injustice. It was in this context that Hitler found his opportunity to rise politically. He founded the National Socialist Party and through fiery speeches became the voice of those demanding revenge and redemption for Germany. While Churchill insisted on defending British parliamentary democracy and international balance, Hitler built a radical narrative filled with hatred toward minorities and promises of territorial expansion. The ideological gap that had begun in their youth now grew wider than ever. During the 1930s, these differences became even more evident. From the political opposition, Churchill clearly denounced the danger that Hitler represented, at a time when many in Britain and across Europe preferred to look the other way. The rise of Nazism did not surprise him. To Churchill, it was the logical consequence of leaving Germany humiliated, but at the same time unchecked in the face of extremist leaders. The contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a British politician who, even without holding power, warned of the threat posed by an aggressive regime in the heart of Europe. On the other, a German leader who turned resentment into an ideological machine aimed at reshaping the continent under his domination. During this period, still before the outbreak of war, Hitler already saw Churchill as a troublesome enemy. Not because Churchill held the office of Prime Minister, but because he embodied a firm voice, a voice that challenged Hitler's ambitions long before they materialized into invasions and battles. The 1930s were a decisive decade, the period in which the path leading to World War II began to take shape. It was not a sudden outbreak, but a slow process in which European leaders, through their decisions and mistakes, allowed Hitler to carry out his expansionist plans. During these years, the roles became clear: Chamberlain as the symbol of conciliation, Churchill as the lone voice of warning, and Hitler as the leader who already viewed Churchill as an enemy long before Britain declared war. When Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937, Britain was in a delicate situation. The memory of the First World War was still vivid. The loss of millions of lives, the enormous economic cost, and the collective trauma continued to weigh heavily on British society. Most citizens did not want to relive that experience, and politicians were well aware of it. Chamberlain believed that the best way to avoid another conflict was through appeasement, granting some of Hitler's demands in the hope that once satisfied, the German leader would stop. This policy was rooted in the idea that Germany had legitimate grievances over the Treaty of Versailles, and that allowing certain territorial adjustments would not pose a major risk. Appeasement also had practical motivations. Britain was not ready for a full-scale war. Its army lacked sufficient strength, its air force was not yet modernized, and its navy, though powerful, could not cover every front. Gaining time seemed the only viable strategy. In this context, Churchill was out of government, but from the House of Commons and through the press, he became the fiercest critic of both Hitler and the policy of appeasement. He repeatedly warned that every concession only strengthened Nazism. While other leaders placed their faith in diplomacy, Churchill closely studied Germany's actions, the accelerated rearmament, the military tests, the propaganda. To him, there was no doubt, Hitler did not seek negotiation, but domination over Europe. His warnings, however, were not well received. He was labeled an alarmist, an exaggerator, even someone trapped in the past, obsessed with a Germany that no longer existed. Many in Parliament saw him as an inconvenient voice, an obstacle to Chamberlain's efforts for peace. Yet his speeches lingered in the minds of those who were beginning to suspect that Hitler would not stop so easily. From Germany, Hitler observed his British adversaries closely. He saw Chamberlain as a man he could negotiate with, someone willing to give ground to avoid confrontation. But Churchill was different. Even before he came to power in 1940, Hitler perceived him as a personal threat. Churchill represented everything the Führer despised: a determined politician, a master of oratory, a staunch defender of the liberal order, and someone unafraid to call him out as a danger to Europe. For Hitler, Churchill was not merely an opposition member of Parliament. He was an enemy long before 1939, a symbol of resistance that had to be destroyed to secure Germany's triumph. The case of Czechoslovakia and Poland, the breaking point. The Czechoslovak crisis of 1938 was the episode that most clearly revealed the difference between Chamberlain and Churchill. Hitler demanded the annexation of the Sudetenland, a Czechoslovak region with a German-speaking population. At the Munich conference, Chamberlain and other European leaders accepted that demand, convinced they were preserving peace. He returned to London proclaiming that he had secured peace for our time. Churchill immediately responded with a scathing speech. "We have been given the choice between dishonor and war. We have chosen dishonor, and we shall have war to him. The Munich Agreement was not a diplomatic victory but a disguised surrender, and history would prove him right. In March 1939, Hitler broke all his promises and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement had failed spectacularly. Chamberlain's credibility collapsed, and Churchill's warnings began to carry far greater weight. The true breaking point came with Poland. When Hitler demanded the Danzig Corridor and ultimately invaded the country on September 1, 1939, there was no longer any room for concessions. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. This marked the official beginning of World War II. From that moment on, Hitler no longer saw Churchill as a bothersome opponent, but as an enemy who had to be defeated in order to achieve his ambitions. And although Churchill was not yet Prime Minister, he was already emerging as the figure who would embody Britain's resistance against the Nazi war machine. The crisis that led to the change of leadership in London was not an accident, but the consequence of several weeks during which British politics clashed directly with the reality of war. Early that year, setbacks on the fronts, poorly executed operations, and the sense that the government could not find an effective response undermined confidence in those occupying Downing Street. The Norwegian campaign had exposed problems of command and coordination. In Parliament, fierce and prolonged debates made it clear that the majority no longer trusted the executive's ability to lead a high-level war. Thus, in early May 1940, Neville Chamberlain, whose name was associated with attempts at appeasement and diplomatic solutions that were no longer sufficient, lost the basic support any government needs in wartime. His resignation opened the door to an alternative that had been foreshadowed in political rhetoric for years. Winston Churchill was called to form a coalition government, assuming the position of Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, amid an atmosphere of national emergency. Nothing in Churchill's style was accidental. He rose to leadership in the middle of the storm because he embodied a combination of determination, rhetorical skill, and will to act that the hour demanded. Just 3 days after taking office, he delivered before the House of Commons a speech that marked a before and after in the country's morale. He spoke plainly about the sacrifices that the conflict would demand and did not seek false comforts. Instead of easy promises, he offered a call to commitment and collective effort. Blood, toil, tears, and sweat, he said. A brief and harsh formula that conveyed the idea that this would not be a war of rhetoric but of cost paid. That honesty, far from sinking the nation, gave it focus, the expectation that, if suffering was necessary, it would be endured with the will to resist and without giving in to demoralization. In the days that followed, military events multiplied the tension. The rapid collapse of Allied armies on the continent left Britain in near total isolation, with the evacuation of the expeditionary forces from the beaches of northern France unfolding as a dramatic exodus. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, the rescue operation managed to embark hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The fact that a substantial part of the army could be saved to fight another day changed the seriousness of the situation, but not its urgency. Churchill understood that a retreat of that magnitude had to be interpreted politically, not as a final defeat, but as an opportunity to regroup. In later speeches, he turned the evacuation into an element that strengthened the will to fight, without hiding the vulnerability that still existed. This ability to transform operational setbacks into political narrative was decisive, giving meaning to a lesser loss in order to preserve greater strength. While forces in London were reorganized and government decisions were adjusted to the rhythm of the emergency, the nation experienced nights of expectation and days of frantic preparation. The threat of invasion meant that everything had to be made ready for a prolonged confrontation. The production of materials, the reorganization of anti-air defenses, civil protection plans, and a political response capable of sustaining public morale. Churchill understood that the war would be won as much in the factories as in the minds of the people. Therefore, his strategy was not only military but also communicational. He made language a strategic tool. His speeches did not seek to console, but to consolidate collective discipline in the face of the challenge. In that process, It was crucial not to feign empty optimism, but to insist on duty, resilience, and the conviction that organized resistance could neutralize the threat. The German response, for its part, revolved around a clear tactical calculation. To invade the island, air superiority had to be secured. The Luftwaffe launched a campaign initially focused on neutralizing airfields, factories, and the infrastructure that allowed the Royal Air Force to retain its ability to respond. But the conflict in the skies gave rise to a very specific technical and human confrontation. The management of resources, the quality of command, maintenance logistics, and the capacity to train and deploy pilots and mechanics became decisive factors. On the British side, the early warning and interception control system, the network combining radar, observers, and command centers, offered an operational advantage that could not be ignored. Combined with pilot skill, it allowed fewer resources to achieve greater effect. Moreover, aircraft such as the Spitfire and the Hurricane, though different in performance, played complementary roles. The combination of technology, experience, and doctrine enabled the RAF to hold where other forces might have fallen. The air battle was also a war of psychological attrition. As weeks passed and it became clear that the British Air Force could not be fully destroyed, the German strategy partially shifted its target, from military installations to widespread bombings of cities. The result was the chapter that entered collective memory as the Blitz, nights of fire over neighborhoods and urban centers intended to break civilian morale and force the government to surrender or negotiate. In response, British leadership acted not only militarily but civically. Shelters, community organization, volunteer work, and the idea that every act of daily normality was an act of resistance. Churchill skillfully used these symbolic and organizational resources. He led the nation not only with military orders, but with a constant appeal to solidarity and perseverance. In the eyes of the Nazi high command, and especially of Hitler himself, Churchill's figure took on special significance. He was no longer merely an inconvenient parliamentarian or political rival. His appointment and his operational leadership represented a new phase of the war. In the early months, Hitler had entertained various possible outcomes: that British resistance would tire, that German priorities would shift eastward, or that negotiations could lead to a workable arrangement. Churchill's arrival closed many of those doors. His refusal to consider surrender and his ability to articulate a coherent national response made any form of agreement unfeasible. Among Nazi strategists, there was debate over whether he was to be underestimated or treated with caution. The practical conclusion was that he stood as an obstacle to Germany's hopes for swift domination of the continent. That perception translated into concrete decisions. Plans for an invasion could not proceed while facing a Britain determined to resist. Operation Sea Lion thus became contingent on gaining air superiority, and when that proved elusive, the invasion's impracticality became clear. The failure to carry out the invasion forced Germany to alter its broader strategy, maintaining pressure across the Channel, intensifying strategic bombings, and preparing for a prolonged war that would drain resources and fronts, weakening its efforts elsewhere. From Hitler's perspective, Churchill had gone from being an irritating obstacle to the cornerstone of why a quick victory was no longer possible. It is important to understand that their relationship was not simply one of visceral hatred versus admiration. It was rather a mixture of ideological contempt and strategic recognition. Hitler despised the political system Churchill represented and saw in him a battle for the dominance of values. Yet that contempt did not blind him to the reality that the British Prime Minister possessed a genuine ability to mobilize resources, form alliances, and sustain a war of attrition. In practice, that ambivalence shaped decision-making. Ideological underestimation was mixed with operational caution, which paradoxically made it harder for Germany to achieve its grandest ambitions. The Battle of Britain, much more than a sequence of air battles, defined a historical possibility. If the RAF lost, the invasion would be feasible. If it endured, the project of rapid domination would collapse. The combination of technical factors, radar, command, industrial performance, and human ones, pilots' courage, civilian sacrifice, ministerial coordination, built an effective defense. At the same time, Churchill's communicative strategy maintained internal political cohesion. His rhetoric was lucid and severe, avoiding triumphalism and reinforcing discipline. It was not an epic victory without cost, but a strategic containment that preserved the foundation upon which the later struggle would be built. In the shadow of those battles, Churchill's stature grew in the eyes of the world and became a symbol impossible for Hitler to ignore. The dictator realized that it was not enough to defeat armies. He needed to break the leadership will that embodied resistance. Thus, every German failure in the Channel and in the skies was interpreted in Berlin as the result of the political persistence Churchill represented. That persistence altered Germany's strategic horizon. It prolonged the war and ultimately forced resources to be diverted from the West, opening opportunities that the Allied powers would later exploit. In this way, the first months of Churchill's leadership marked a crucial turning point. His arrival was not an isolated symbolic episode, but the engine of a political and psycho-military reorientation that neutralized the possibility of an immediate British defeat. The combination of firm political decisions, speeches that balanced sacrifice and purpose, and the effective use of technical and human resources in air defense turned British resistance into a real barrier. For Hitler, that barrier was not merely a sum of planes and radar stations, it was the expression of an organized will under the direction of a man who refused to negotiate the continent's enslavement. And that fact, more than anything else, explains why Churchill became a central target of both resentment and strategy in that crucial phase of the war. From an early age, Hitler forged a worldview in which every race, every nation, every individual had a hierarchical place. For him, not all peoples were equal. In his racial conception, Germans occupied the top. The Aryans, he claimed, possessed innate superiority. France, Poland, the Slavs, the Jews, and the Roma were considered inferior, destined to live under the rule of the strong. Within this moral social hierarchy, he saw the British Empire as a double mirror. Admiration for its vast colonial power, its navy that ruled the seas, its territories spanning every continent, and at the same time, deep resentment, seeing in that empire a rival and a model that Germany aspired to follow or surpass. Churchill, by contrast, emerged from a different historical tradition: British parliamentary governance, liberalism, and commitment to individual liberty. He had grown up in an empire that boasted freedom of the press and expression, albeit with contradictions, yet at least with a firm stance against authoritarianism whenever it threatened the European status quo. When Hitler came to power, Churchill saw him not merely as a charismatic leader or ambitious politician, but as a bearer of ideas completely contrary to everything he considered civilization: racism, persecution, and a dehumanized military machine. Hitler's racial worldview was not abstract theory, but active doctrine. It defined who had rights, who was an enemy, and who should be eliminated. This doctrine also framed Britain through another lens, not as a potential ally, but as a racial and geopolitical obstacle. In Nazi speeches, Britain appeared as a decadent nation, weakened by racial mixing, infused with liberal weakness, morally inferior compared to the Aryan purity Hitler preached. This vision justified not only territorial expansion and Lebensraum, but also an unimaginable confrontation with an empire so symbolically strong. Churchill, for his part, did more than react. In many ways, he was prepared for this confrontation. Since the 1920s, he had warned that Germany would not be content with its borders, that German nationalism under the Führer would become ruthless tyranny. In diaries, newspaper articles, and speeches in Westminster, he repeated that Nazism was not merely another political movement. It was a corruption of humanity that threatened everything Western civilization had sought to build after the Great War. He called the Nazi ideology an unimaginable abuse of power, a heresy against human value. He did not hesitate to point out the oppression of minorities, legalized anti-Semitism, concentration camps, and the purge of opponents as if they were ordinary, accepted crimes. Amid this clash of ideas, words between them became weapons. Hitler, in internal memoranda, private speeches, and propaganda, attacked Churchill fiercely. He called him warmongering, a belligerent orator, a man of empty words bent on keeping a war alive that he deemed inevitable, and saw in him the hand of subversive agents, the international Jews, bankers, and interests conspiring against Germany. In one speech, he accused Churchill of provoking wars for personal gain, manipulating his countrymen to accept unnecessary sacrifices. To Hitler, Churchill was not just a political leader. He was the symbol of a global conspiracy, a tangible obstacle to his racial ideal. Churchill responded not only in memorable speeches but also in private writings. He described Hitler as an enemy of the natural order, someone possessed by ambition. For Churchill, Hitler embodied totalitarianism, a force that, if allowed, would sweep across Europe. And his condemnation was not merely political but human. He saw institutionalized hatred, systematic cruelty toward dissenters, the torture of body and spirit, and the elimination of those he deemed inferior. For Churchill, the Nazi disregard for human life made it an existential threat. Beyond rhetoric, there was personal hatred, a concrete animosity from Hitler toward Churchill. It was not just a rivalry for power or strategic positions, but an obsession. Hitler understood that Churchill embodied a resistance that would not bend. Every radiogram announcing that Britain held out, every British speech declaring that it would not negotiate surrender, arrived as a provocation. He saw Churchill as a totem representing the resilience of the perfect adversary. No capitulation, no truce. This enraged and obsessed him. In Hitler's mind, defeating Churchill was not only a military or political matter, but a symbolic one, toppling the man who would not yield, proving that no leader could challenge his will. Among the British people, Churchill became the moral shield of a nation under siege. His voice conveyed not only military strategy but hope. That hope, for Hitler, became an unbearable burden. Even more, in private conversations with his collaborators, Hitler referred to Churchill as a personal enemy, someone whose very existence complicated his plans. It was not enough to defeat the British army. He had to break British will, and Churchill represented that will. Defeating him meant humiliating not just an enemy nation, but the very ideal of resistance itself. This ideological conflict thus became a war of symbols. Hitler propagated the idea of Aryan superiority, purity, and a German empire, opposed by a leader who declared, "We shall never surrender." In that phrase, in that firmness, Churchill became a universal emblem of opposition to tyranny. In his speeches, and in messages transmitted beyond Britain's borders, morality was presented not as a political accessory, but as a central axis. Defending freedom, fighting racism, protecting human dignity. For Churchill, these were not mere battle slogans, but fundamental values distinguishing humans from monsters. Thus, it is clear that when we speak of the hatred between Hitler and Churchill, it is not just two men in disagreement. It is a clash of irreconcilable worldviews. One exalted hierarchy based on blood, race, and subjugation, versus another insisting on equality, liberty, and the duty to resist. It was not merely politics, it was the essence of what each believed it meant to be human. When Germany invaded Poland, the war ceased to be a distant threat and became a brutal reality. From that moment on, the relationship between Hitler and Churchill intensified as enemy versus enemy, but also as adversaries shaping history with every decision, every defeat, every gritted tooth. Hitler, convinced that his superior war machine, blitzkrieg, and alliances would strike quickly, expected Britain to break. He believed that once France was humiliated, the British Isles, isolated, harassed from the air, would eventually seek peace. But the early European failures began to weigh on him. The disaster at Dunkirk was a tactical defeat for the Allies, yes, but for Hitler, it was also a moral defeat. An army had escaped. His inability to force an immediate British surrender revealed that the British would not be defeated solely with military superiority on land or by bombings. British resilience was reinvigorated, and with every enemy plane shot down, every fallen pilot fighting for his country, Hitler's frustration grew. Meanwhile, Churchill, based at Downing Street, conducted diplomacy that went beyond pure combat. He knew that Britain's survival depended not only on radar, Spitfires, or hurricanes, but on alliances. In this scenario, the entry of the United States changed the board. Although Roosevelt was initially hesitant, Churchill lobbied, pleaded with allies, offered bases, and provided all manner of diplomatic support. Every letter, every visit, every late-night negotiation was a bet to tip the scales. Churchill saw in Washington not only a necessary arm, but the force that would create a front Hitler could not cover everywhere at once. Hitler, from his bunker or from command rooms in Berlin, observed all this with contempt and fear. He saw Roosevelt as someone manipulated by the interests Churchill directed. In his mind, Churchill was the puppeteer, the hidden brain behind U.S. permissions, behind logistical support, behind financing. He believed that if he defeated Churchill, he would strike at the heart of the supposed global Allied leadership. That image obsessed him. Churchill was no longer just the British Prime Minister, but the symbol of an international alliance rallying against Nazism. Every highly successful British offensive, every convoy that arrived, every troop rescue, every supply crossing the Atlantic was an added humiliation for Hitler. It was not just military failures. It was strategic failure for not having subjugated Britain as he expected, for not achieving that definitive act of domination. Massive bombings, attacks on London, attempts to paralyze industry, to break civilian morale, all proved insufficient. British resistance grew stronger. Churchill's morale became a shield that repelled each assault. Churchill, aware of the symbolic weight of these actions, was not only commanding armies but also guiding hope. Each speech, "We shall fight on the beaches, never surrender," their finest hour, was not just inspiring words. They were coatings of moral steel. He knew that defeating Nazism required not only weapons, but faith in victory and public conviction. Diplomacy accompanied this effort. Agreements with Russia when necessary, coordination with British colonies, and tireless efforts to unite the world's democratic opposition against tyranny. As the war progressed, Hitler began to hate that living British ideal, that ideal of resistance, showing that not everything could be broken with tanks or racial hatred. Scenes appeared in his high command, in official speeches, where Churchill was mentioned not only as a military enemy, but as a promoter of a global conspiracy, a metaphysical obstacle. For Hitler, it was not enough to crush armies. He had to destroy the spirit of opposition that Churchill represented, believing that spirit was the seed of Germany's defeat. During this period, German failures were not only tactical, they were also symbolic. The Battle of the Atlantic, the sinking of Allied submarines thanks to new technologies, the air resistance frustrating the Luftwaffe, bombings that failed to surrender London, alliances growing against the Axis. Every moment Britain refused to yield struck directly at Hitler's ego and deepened his frustration. He had not expected an isolated island to resist so long, maintain open ports, supply routes, diplomatic networks, scientific collaboration chains, and code-breaking intelligence. When the United States fully entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler was forced to open multiple fronts. The East, with the Soviet Union, North Africa, Western Europe, and the Western Air Front. Suddenly, his empire of expansion was entangled in numerous simultaneous challenges. Churchill, on the other hand, saw opportunity, with the Americans not only as military allies, but as providers of mass production, logistical support, financing, supplies, and technology. It was the diplomacy of alliances that made the difference, not only fighting with weapons, but weaving political networks, convincing governments, coordinating different armed forces, maintaining the morale of a bombed and weary population. It was this combination, military resistance plus international diplomacy plus moral leadership, that enraged Hitler. Every report that Roosevelt considered sending troops, or that areas occupied by Italy or the Nazis were experiencing uprisings, or that local resistance would not yield, fueled in Hitler a mixture of strategic fury and personal hatred. He saw that his dream of total subjugation was being obstructed not only by foreign armies, but by the spirit of resistance Churchill symbolized. This chapter of the war shows that the enmity between Hitler and Churchill was not just the result of conflicting ideologies, but of concrete clashes, military failures, diplomacy painstakingly woven day by day, unexpected involvement of decisive actors like the United States, and Hitler's inability to politically, logistically, and morally subdue a Britain that refused to yield. And in that resistance, in that steadfastness, one of the decisive factors for the outcome was forged. Not only who had the strongest tanks, but who had the firmest will to resist when all seemed lost. As the calendar moved toward 1944, the shadows Hitler had cast over Europe began to fade. The offensive that once seemed unstoppable encountered a wall of successive defeats. The so-called Third Reich, conceived to last 1,000 years, was beginning to show deep cracks in just a decade. Failures on the Eastern Front, with the harsh Russian winter as an unrelenting enemy, were weakening his forces. German cities, once symbols of power, suffered continuous bombings. The Allies had shattered the notion of invulnerability that Hitler had sold to his people. Meanwhile, Churchill saw the fruits of his perseverance starting to emerge. Meetings with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin at decisive conferences showcased the Britain's political skill. At Yalta, in early 1945, he sat alongside the other two giants of the coalition to decide Europe's future once the war concluded. There, on the Crimean Peninsula, the fate of Germany, the reconstruction of the continent, and the new borders to be drawn on the map were discussed. Churchill, aware of the historical significance of the moment, insisted on the need to guarantee the freedom of nations that had suffered under the Nazi yoke, though he also had to accept difficult compromises regarding Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Months later, at the Potsdam Conference, now without Roosevelt, he met with Harry Truman and Stalin. By then, Germany had surrendered, and the world was looking toward a new balance of power. Churchill's relationship with his allies was also evolving, but he made his position clear. Britain had to remain a decisive actor in the new world order. Although he would lose the office of Prime Minister in elections later that year, his voice at Potsdam demonstrated that even at the end of his term, he remained a central figure in decisions shaping the post-war world. In Berlin, meanwhile, Hitler's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Soviet armies were encircling the German capital. The economy was in ruins, communications were collapsing one by one, and confidence in the Führer was plummeting. In his bunker, Hitler continued issuing orders disconnected from military reality, demanding impossible offensives, blaming his generals for every failure. News of Churchill's unwavering resistance reached him as constant reminders of his defeat. Despite their ideological differences, Hitler never ceased to perceive Churchill as the symbol of the enemy who had resisted him until the end. In the final days of April 1945, as Soviet troops entered Berlin, Hitler drafted his political testament. In it, he accused his enemies of conspiracy and revealed his persistent resentment toward the British, whom he considered responsible, along with the international Jews, for Germany's catastrophe. His references to Churchill were still steeped in contempt, but also contained a kind of tacit recognition. He had been the adversary who never yielded. The man he had underestimated so many times became proof that the will of a leader can frustrate even the most formidable war machine. On April 30th of that same year, Hitler took his own life in the Chancellery bunker. With this act, the symbol of Nazism collapsed definitively. The news spread quickly across Europe and the rest of the world, and in London, Churchill addressed a nation exhausted but victorious. His words, sober and measured, did not celebrate personal revenge, but the triumph of freedom over tyranny. He had led his people through darkness and could now witness the dawn of peace. The decline of the Third Reich and Hitler's fall sealed the rivalry that had defined an era. For Churchill, this ending was not just a military victory, but the confirmation that resistance and perseverance could overcome an adversary that had seemed invincible. For Hitler, the outcome was the bitter realization that his personal hatred of Churchill, his obsession with breaking the British will, had been one of many strategic blind spots that precipitated his downfall. Thus ended the story of a confrontation that transcended politics and war. Churchill emerged from the conflict as a symbol of democratic determination, Hitler as an emblem of absolute evil. In that final contrast lies the closure of an enmity that defined the fate of the 20th century. A clash between freedom and tyranny, between the perseverance of a people and the brutality of an ideology that promised to dominate the world and ended in ruins. When the cannons fell silent and the smoking ruins of Europe began to cool, one question lingered, one that historians, journalists, and contemporaries of the war could not stop asking: what kind of hatred bound the names of Hitler and Churchill so unbreakably? Beyond the battlefronts, incendiary speeches, and military alliances, the confrontation between these two men reveals a tension far deeper than mere political enmity. It was simultaneously a clash of systems and a personal struggle, a collision of worldviews that turned their rivalry into something almost mythical. First, it is necessary to distinguish between political hatred and personal hatred. The political stemmed from their incompatible projects. Hitler represented a racial totalitarianism, a program aiming to redraw the map of Europe with blood hierarchies and erase all notion of equality. Churchill embodied the defense of parliamentarism and the classical liberties that Britain considered its most valuable heritage. On this level, the clash was inevitable. There was no room for lasting agreements between someone seeking to subjugate the continent through terror and someone committed to safeguarding the autonomy of European nations. Every military decision, every diplomatic conference, every radio address fed off this essential incompatibility. But alongside that ideological antagonism grew something more intimate. Hitler, obsessed with his own image of invincibility, could not tolerate that a single man, leading a bombarded island with limited resources, was able to resist him. Every time Churchill appeared in the newsreels, every time he delivered a speech boosting British morale, the Führer felt his authority challenged. He saw it as a personal affront. In private conversations, and in his final testament, his language regarding Churchill dripped with fury. He spoke of him not merely as the leader of an enemy, but as the individual who had frustrated his plans, the human face of his defeat. It was a hatred that transcended strategy, a resentment that accompanied him to his final hours. Analyzing this relationship, some historians suggest that Hitler's declared hatred of Churchill may have been, in part, a covert acknowledgement. Deep down, the German dictator knew that this British politician had been the only one capable of challenging him relentlessly from the start, anticipating his moves, and keeping his country cohesive even under the worst bombardments. By making him a personal enemy, Hitler may have been admitting, though never openly, that he saw in Churchill a kindred determination, a distorted mirror of his own obsession with power. The legacy left by both reinforces this reading. Hitler went down in history as the symbol of absolute evil, a dictator responsible for genocide, a war that claimed tens of millions of lives, and the destruction of entire cities. His name became synonymous with barbarism. Churchill, in contrast, was etched into collective memory as the emblem of resistance, the politician who held his nation together when all seemed lost, and who knew how to forge a global alliance to halt tyranny. Of course, his figure is not immune to criticism. His role in colonialism, famines, and controversial decisions has been widely debated. Yet in the context of World War II, his image solidified as the leader who never yielded to darkness. Thus, the hatred that defined their relationship was not a mere whim of character. It was the result of a total clash of worldviews, personalities, and ambitions. Hitler did not hate Churchill only because he was the head of a hostile government. He hated him because he represented the antithesis of everything Hitler stood for. Churchill, in turn, understood that defeating Hitler meant defeating an ideology that denied human dignity at its core. The contempt and confrontation between them became, over time, a kind of moral duel that shaped the course of the 20th century. Ultimately, the enmity between Hitler and Churchill is a reminder of how individual decisions can influence the fate of entire nations. It was a hatred that moved armies, sustained resistances, inspired speeches, and shaped generations. It was not simply two men who detested each other. It was two worlds colliding, two conceptions of humanity that could not coexist. And in that collision, much of contemporary history was forged. At the end of this historical journey, the question that guided us from the beginning resonates more clearly. Why did Hitler hate Churchill? The answer is not found in a single reason, but in the collision of two irreconcilable worlds. Hitler saw in Churchill the obstacle that stood in the way of his dream of a totalitarian empire. He was not merely the prime minister of an enemy country, he was the embodiment of everything Nazism sought to destroy: parliamentary democracy, individual freedom, and the determination of a people not to be subjugated. Churchill, in turn, understood from an early stage that Nazism was not a fleeting threat, but an existential danger. His constant resistance, his ability to keep Britain standing, and his skill in forging global alliances frustrated Hitler's calculations again and again until the final collapse of the Third Reich. Thus, Hitler's hatred for Churchill was political, because two impossible to reconcile ideologies clashed, and it was personal because the British leader demonstrated that human will could overcome the Nazi machinery of terror. At its core, that hatred contained an implicit acknowledgement. Hitler understood that as long as Churchill lived, total German victory would never be possible. With this conclusion, it is clear that the confrontation between them was not just a rivalry between two wartime leaders. It was a clash of values that defined the 20th century and left an indelible mark on humanity's memory. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more in-depth stories explaining the great moments of our history, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next episodes. Your support helps us continue creating content that brings to life the events that shaped the world. We'll see you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the great figures and the turning points that shaped history. Thank you for joining us.